Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today we are going to talk about a psychological phenomenon that has existed, I'm sure, since the beginning of human beings, and that is inflation. Jung identified it in its most sort of bare bones and simple form as identification with the collective psyche. In other words, consciousness takes into and onto itself contents from the archetypal realm that actually can possess consciousness and run our lives for us. You know, there are all kinds of phenomena there. It can be grandiose, creative, spiritual, collective, has many fingers on this particular hand, and of course, some mythological antecedents. Without getting inflated, let's see if we can discuss inflation.
So, Deb, as I'm thinking about inflation, my mind naturally wants to categorize nuances around different ways of being inflated, different ways of having the unconscious grab us and push us in a direction. And we often don't know what's happening until there's some kind of fragile, vulnerable mishap that then sends us crashing down. We're all familiar with the kind of grandiose inflation, where an archetype rises up in someone's psyche and then compels them to feel somewhat superhuman. People can feel like a hero and rush into circumstances certain that they're going to overcome an adversity and find themselves really grievously injured, for instance, or overestimating what they're able to actually do in a moment. Negative inflations happen, which are sometimes rather mysterious, but we all know a friend who will berate themselves and experience themselves as very dark and shadowy. And then they'll say things like, well, I said this sentence at work and it must have just destroyed the self-esteem of my colleague, just ruined their day or ruined their life even. And what you can hear in that is the feeling that the slightest mishap can just blight the world in another person's life. And that's also an inflation. There are creative inflations, which historically we see highly creative individuals, artists, often feel that there is a driving spirit in them. Jung called it a daimon, taken from a kind of Greek idea of a guiding spirit. And sometimes that guiding spirit or archetype can be so demanding that artists don't eat, or they take on other kinds of addictive processes, or other areas of their lives are just ruined by the demand to be constantly creative, and they don't seem to have a choice about it. Spiritual inflation is something that is happening in ever greater intensity in the US culture. People are swept away into emotionally heightened experiences of spirituality. They feel that God is actually in them, and they're certain that God is giving them instructions in every nuanced aspects of their lives, or they believe certain leaders are imbued with kind of spiritual superiority. That can be difficult as well. There's also a normal developmental inflation that we can all remember experiencing. As teenagers, we'll sometimes have a sense of having more capacity than we really do. And every parent remembers times when they've had to tell a teenager, whoa, slow down, back off. I'm not giving you the keys to the car. It's 17 to go out for a little joyride, or any number of other things that they may think should be easy or they're entitled to. And they're really overestimating their capacities.
Well, that's a great list, Joseph, and I'm thinking maybe we can unpack those one by one. I'd like to propose that we start by talking about grandiose inflations. This is the kind that we're probably most familiar with. I'm thinking we can go back to the ancient world, and the Greeks talked about inflation. They used the term hubris, and they considered it a sin against the gods. In ancient Rome, they referred to this phenomenon as superbia, and they realized they had to guard against it, or it could endanger the common good. There's a story that victorious generals would be paraded through Rome with cheering throngs of people, and the general would be in the chariot garbed in imperial purple, but behind him would stand a slave whispering in his ear repeatedly, "Remember, you are mortal," so that the general wouldn't get caught up in this inflation that would be dangerous.
I'm also thinking about how that kind of grandiose inflation certainly has its mythological antecedents. One of the stories about that is Phaeton, who was the son of the sun god Helios. He had been told by his mother that his father was the sun god Helios, but had never seen his father. His schoolmates were teasing him, and he wanted proof from his father, acknowledgement that Phaeton was his son. So off he went up into wherever Helios resided, and the father acknowledged, "Yes, you are my son. In order for you to be able to prove it and have some assurance of this, I'll grant you a favor." And the son said, "Okay, I would like to drive the chariot of the sun that makes the sun rise in the morning and set at night. I'd like to drive that chariot with its incredibly powerful horses for one day. Let me do that." And the father said, "No, no, no." But he'd given his word that son could have whatever he wanted. And so the son did do that. And in some versions, he first drove the chariot with these powerful horses, too powerful even for Zeus to manage, too high, and the earth froze. And then it went too low, and the earth was scorched, at which point Zeus intervened with a thunderbolt and blasted Phaeton off the chariot, and that was the end of him. But that is that kind of premature arrogation to oneself of far too much power, that I am it, rather than a more subtle process of discernment and discrimination. Kind of reminds me of the teenagers you were talking about, Joseph.
Yeah, and we might return to that story, I think, when we talk about developmental inflation, because there is something in that story about that. But, I want to pick up on something that you said, Deb, which is I think that a grandiose inflation always involves an arrogation of that which is divine, or we might say archetypal, to the conscious personality or the ego. And it's always inappropriate and dangerous, even if it's sometimes understandable. And maybe as a little kind of case vignette, as it were, I'd like to lift up this film that I'm just crazy about, called Grizzly Man, which is a documentary by Werner Herzog about a bear enthusiast named Timothy Treadwell. And Treadwell became convinced that he had to protect the grizzly bears in the Katmai National Forest in Alaska. If you watch the film, he says things like, "No one's out there protecting the bears but me," which apparently there's no evidence for that. I think the bears were not being subjected to poaching, and they were fine. But Treadwell kind of arrogated this role of being, this almost kind of divine protector of the bears, and he really felt that he could kind of be the bears' friends. I mean, there's just this sort of stunning footage in this documentary about him kind of swimming around with these grizzly bears or walking up to them, and he's just convinced that that he's able to kind of I guess befriend them. And one of the most interesting parts in the film to me is when the filmmaker interviews a native anthropologist. So he is, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the cultural group that he's associated with, because I'm afraid I'll screw it up. But he says he's a PhD in anthropology, and I believe he runs a museum. He says, Treadwell tried to be a bear. For us on the island, you don't do that. You don't invade their territory. For him to act like a bear the way he did, for me, it was the ultimate of disrespecting the bear and what the bear represents. If I look at it from my culture, Timothy Treadwell crossed a boundary that we have lived with for 7,000 years. When we're in right relationship with archetypal contents, we understand that's for over there and we don't cross that line. But when the ego gets inflated and takes on these archetypal powers and disregards that line, like Phaeton did, well, what happens at the end of the film, as you might imagine, is that Treadwell gets eaten by a bear. I mean, that's what happens.
And not only did he get eaten by a bear, but he invited his girlfriend up and they were camping and she got killed too. So it's just the contagion effect of this kind of grandiosity and inflation. It's not just about one person. It extends to family members, sometimes whole communities and whole countries.
I think we can see these moments on YouTube films all the time of people trying to go and pet a wild animal, trying to walk outside of their car in the middle of a safari park just to go hug something dangerous, and something disastrous happens. And something sweeps into those individuals and divorces them from the fragility of being human. And how we can think about it is the archetypes are these universal patterns. They're captured in the mythology of gods. So if a certain kind of godlike force inhabits your consciousness, you're throwing the car open to go pet the lion in the middle of the safari, that godlike force inside of you doesn't suffer anything. You suffer it.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. It's, I'm thinking about this form of inflation as, sort of extroversion run wild. Grizzly Man is such a great example of that the projection of one's own power onto others or onto the bear or onto some force that one has that is larger than life, and it goes out and it has a huge ripple effect. In the case of Treadwell, of course, it was death. In the case of Phaeton, same thing. But it's extroverted. It's out there in the world, assuming or arrogating power to itself that affects people and processes.
Well, and it's also possibly associated with bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a way that inflation can be a symptom of a mental health disorder like bipolar. I mean, grandiosity is one of the symptoms of the manic phase of bipolar disorder.
And hysteria, but the need to involve others, to impact others or the world or grizzly bears.
Now, I think we can't move off the topic of grandiose inflation without looking to history. Jung wrote a letter in 1938, and it was titled Diagnosing the Dictators. And he references his thoughts on Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini. And because these dictators were causing so much suffering and so much chaotic change across Europe, this was a reasonable area of curiosity for Jung, who lived in the midst of this tumult. And because we are also in the midst of this tumult with Donald Trump, it's relevant to be curious around this psychology. Jung wrote a really extensive essay around this, which would be difficult for us to all summarize. But what he noticed is that there are two kinds of grandiose dictators. One is a kind of chieftain type, and that person is possessed by the archetype of the hero. And this is the kind of leader who believes that he can crush the people who oppose him quite literally and exalt all of those who are aligned with him and promise a kind of superhuman lifestyle and a superhuman feeling of triumph if they were to move along with them. Jung looked at Hitler slightly differently, and he felt that Hitler was being possessed by a kind of shamanic archetype. And as he analyzed the way in which Hitler could sense what was happening in those Germans with inferiority complexes who were at the lower rungs of the culture, intuitively, their needs, their wants, their experience could rise up in Hitler's imagination, and he could speak it back to them in such a way that they felt heard and that they felt inspired and consequently drawn to him and drawn to his directives. And that this happens on a very deep archetypal level. I can't imagine that Hitler cultivated that skill, but that it was noticed, it appeared. Now, taking the whole arc of this horrible chapter in human history, in the end, as Russia and the Allies crushed that movement, Hitler is alone in a bunker with his girlfriend, terrified and committing suicide. And all of the fragility of his actual human experience is returned to him. When we look at some of the propaganda material that Trump is producing and has produced, it is very much in alignment with Hitler's ability to reach into those elements in American society, those people who have a tremendous sense of inferiority and disenfranchisement. And he seems to intuitively be able to reach into the collective story, speak it back to those people, and infuse it with a sense of mysticism and religion. That the new rhetoric, which has contributed to this terrible event last Wednesday, the terrorist attack on the nation's capital, infused it with a feeling of a religious mission. That they were good and they were crusaders, kind of knights of a Fourth Reich to triumph over evil. And so we had people showing up at the Capitol who were dangerous, but also people who were outlandish, wearing strange mythic costumes, laughing and euphoric in their access to these sacred halls. We have to spend some time being curious about how people get swept away in this, both Trump, but also these people who are vulnerable.
So I think what I'm taking from what you've just said so well, Joseph, is how this kind of grandiosity and the intuitive power of some leaders, medicine men types, shaman types, really can veer right into mythology and the power of myth, of these archetypal images and narratives to seize people and move people, as we saw last week with the awful events at the Capitol. This stuff really has power, whether at the individual level of Treadwell and the grizzly bears or at the collective level.
And I want to just push in there and just take it one step further, which when I was researching this episode, I found this quote from Jung that just sort of I'd seen before, but it's the kind of thing you see it again, it kind of knocks your socks off because in some sense we're so susceptible to what we've been talking about. We're so susceptible to possession and inflation because our culture has become untethered from traditional religion. Now, I'm not saying that traditional religion is great and we should all go back there. And, first of all, that ship has sailed. And secondly, there's huge problems with religion too. But Jung talked about this all the time, the loss of meaning that happens because we no longer have the container of a belief system. And here's what he says about it. So we could say with Nietzsche, God is dead. Yet it would be truer to say he has put off our image, and where shall we find him again? Meaning, God isn't dead. Oh no, that power in the psyche that was dressed in Judeo-Christian garb, it's like that the garb is no longer working for most people, but that power is still there. The interregnum is full of danger. For the natural facts will raise their claim in the forms of various isms, which are productive of nothing but anarchy and destruction, because inflation and man's hubris between them have elected to make the ego, in all of its ridiculous paltriness, Lord of the universe.
Wow.
And I think now we're into the category of kind of collective inflation because the ego has set itself up as Lord of the universe. We're all susceptible to inflation and being possessed by an ism, as we saw this past week.
Part of the collective inflation that we had mentioned when we were preparing for this conversation is the idea that the ego can consume all of nature and have no repercussion. And yet, of course, what we're seeing is that human beings have forgotten their fragile interdependence with these complicated systems that are really barely understandable to us.
Yes, that we're not aware of our interdependence on nature, and all of these systems, as you say, Joseph, and sometimes we forget our dependence on the unconscious too, and we forget how powerful the unconscious is, and that it can be manipulated by charismatic leaders. We can be manipulated in all kinds of ways because it's that arrogation again of that archetypal power and archetypal imagery.
When we talk about that predisposition to disregard the unconscious, it shows up in ways, again, very ubiquitous. The school system decides that, oh, the art program's not important. Oh, the music program's not important. We
Only
don't
STEM.
Right, exactly. What you really need is math. You need math, which is wonderful. Math is great. But this predisposition that ego skills, that's the only thing that's important. And that all the other ways that the unconscious can whisper to us, and not just about fanciful things, but about life-sustaining things and life-sustaining feelings are diminished and considered irrelevant. And we do that to our peril.
I'm thinking about how this kind of inflation in the collective is compensatory, as we've mentioned before, compensatory to a feeling of being an outsider or being disenfranchised, somehow being less than, and that then inflation takes hold as a compensatory effort to overcome a sense of vulnerability or powerlessness. So that if we decide to eliminate programs in the arts for school children and we overvalue, math, engineering, logic, science, that this is an attempt to balance an unconscious process that goes unrecognized. And the lesson here, if there is one, is simply to recognize what is going on in the unconscious, recognize inflation as part of a dynamic, rather than just acting it out and letting it take over without reflection. What are we doing here? What are we doing here? Don't we want our kids to have access to music, art, physical education, enrichment things, to be whole people rather than one-sided, whatever that one-sidedness might look like in any given curriculum?
Well, it is making room for the unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
As we're moving towards talking about young people, perhaps we can just chat a little bit about developmental inflation and, the realms in which it may be normal for teenagers or even children. When we think about kind of, the terrible twos that happen where little kids become like, lords of the household, barking and demanding things. And
So I have a story.
yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Lisa.
So when my son was he was young. He was like maybe 3 or let's say he was 4. And he was playing with a group of kids who were all a little bit older than he was. And their game was a little bit too complicated for him. And he really, really wanted to be a part of it, but he couldn't quite figure it out. I was kind of watching this. He just couldn't quite figure out how to get involved. And so he upended the game by suddenly he was a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And he was charging in and literally knocking over something that they had set up. So he was sort of trying to just upend the game altogether and make it really centered around him. But it was his best effort at trying to meet them in their play. That compensatory factor that you were bringing up, Deb, is at play because he was the underdog there. He was younger. He was the smallest one. And so what did he do? He took on the role of a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Or he became possessed by the spirit of a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Yeah.
But there I think is a good image of developmental inflation. And again, I think that is in the story of Phaeton too. I mean, what I actually love about that story is that he was the son of the sun god. And there is a way that sometimes when we're in a developmental process, for example, we might be able to see, I know I'm capable of doing that. This is really fuzzy in my mind, but I'm thinking that this might be a true story about Steven Spielberg, because I don't think he had any formal training in film. I think he just sort of like, I could do that, and it's that the audacity of, say, a very young person who says, I know I could do that. And so Phaeton wasn't wrong. Like, he was the son of the sun god. He probably could have been trained to lead those horses. He probably had what it took, but it was premature. So there's something too about timing, but there is an inflation that comes at the beginning of a quest. Mm-hmm. When we first get the image of the thing that we want, that we think we're capable of, and we're audacious enough to grab it. And this might also relate to this idea about a creative inflation.
Before we move to that, I just wanted to make another film reference around developmental inflation. And it was that really painful movie, Into the Wild, which came out in about 2007. And it was an adaptation of a nonfiction book by the same name, which is this story about a really young man named Christopher McCandless, who winds up being somewhat traumatized, actually. He finds out that he and his sister were born out of wedlock. There's a big family trauma, happens at a young age, and he decides that he's going to abandon the culture. And he becomes this kind of hitchhiking hippie in a way. And the story, as it evolves, he decides that he is a survivalist, and just because of his natural ebullience and confidence that he can hitchhike to Alaska, he goes into a highly wild area, fords a stream, finds an abandoned bus, which he calls the magic bus, and he just decides that he's going to just figure out how to live off the grid, live off the land. And very tragically, as the movie unfolds, he starves to death. Finally, he eats plants out of desperation, some of which are poisonous, and he becomes very, very ill. And his body is found sometime later by hunters in the area. But what we can see in the story as it unfolds is this teenage certainty that life has blessed him and that he can just figure everything out without actually having either equipment or knowledge.
That is a great example of how important knowledge is, how important training is, how important practice is. Before you drive the chariot of the sun across the sky, don't you think you ought to learn a little bit about horses?
But there's something admirable in the impulse. I read the book and I, it's like, God, the kid was an idiot, but you also, I felt like I was cheering him on, just like I'm sort of cheering on Phaeton. Like, yes, it's a great impulse, but then you have to back it up, Deb, with what you're saying, the training, practice, and the work.
And I'm thinking that, Steven Spielberg, to make him an example, put in, I don't know how many hours, but an awful lot in learning, working, practicing, apprenticing, before he became the well-known film figure that we know him to be. It's a process. Yeah. And I appreciate the sort of the desire to launch out into the quest that teenagers have. And there have been all kinds of studies about their lack of an appropriate sense of vulnerability and so on. And just hitch it to doing the work, apprenticing, practicing, and the less glamorous process than vaunting out into the wild just because you think you can, which speaks of entitlement and inflation.
Yeah, that the developmental inflation, which parents have to nurture even a little bit. A bit of audacity is necessary to leave home and get a first job, to go to college. Yeah. Creative audacity has to submit to discipline. So, of course, you can be a brain surgeon. Of course, you can be the president. Apparently, anybody can be the president these days. That you can take on an incredible role, be a famous film producer, but you must submit to a discipline in order to take your raw talent and shape it into an actual jewel that will allow you to be successful.
Yeah. I'm returning just for a second to Grandiose Inflations because you brought up the Jon Krakauer book. He wrote another book that was also turned into a film called Into Thin Air.
Oh, yeah.
And it was about the disastrous expedition on
Mount Everest.
Mount Everest, thank you.
Oh,
I was going to say that wrong mountain.
Yeah.
But it's another story of inflation. Because some of these people just had this sense of entitlement that they were, some of them were wealthy and important. They didn't necessarily have the training or the equipment, and they ignored warnings. It's like, no, we shouldn't try to summit today. I'm now working off 10-year-old memories here or something, but they ignored it. No, let's go. Let's try to summit, and many of them lost their lives.
So we're really pointing to how inflation can really veer into entitlement, which points to narcissism.
In when it becomes character logic, absolutely.
Absolutely. However, I have to balance this out, looping back to our developmental category here.
We're not
The
really
healthy
doing a good job of
narcissism,
seeing the category.
little kids have a healthy narcissism.
Yeah.
And that does have to be supported. You know, if the 3-year-old that comes in and announces that he can do a somersault, oh, you know, and we mirror that and we go, wow, you know, really, can you show me? It's a balancing and a recognition, I think, in children, and then later in ourselves. One hopes through a self-reflective capacity over how to manage the audacity that says, I want to be a brain surgeon, with
Right.
hitting the books and taking organic chemistry.
Absolutely.
So on that point again, I think that we require a certain amount of inflation before we take on a big project.
We need
Yes.
archetypal help.
Yes. So we can be all puffed up and say, you know, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to start a podcast. and if we don't have a little bit of inflation, we're going to say, no, I could never do that.
The other really common form of developmental inflation is falling in love.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, you're right.
Which is, you know, the inflation of the anima and the animus.
Yes.
You know, and we all remember just those consuming falling in loves that have happened in our lives where, you know, it seems to violate natural law.
Yeah.
And the fatedness of it, and the gods are blessing us, and everything is coming together in just the most perfect way.
Yeah. You know, another place where I see inflation is actually there's this particular kind of inflation that I notice that I think of as a Jungian inflation.
Oh, no.
Because the ideas of Jung are so powerful and so exciting that many people, when they first come in contact with them, get just kind of filled with them. And people will come in and they want to find a Jungian analyst, and they're projecting all of this stuff on you, and they're talking about Jung, or they come to the seminar and they're just sort of so filled with this, it's almost uncontainable. And it can be a little irritating. But on the other hand, I always look warmly toward it because I recognize it. I mean, I felt that too.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of induction into this very important realm.
Yeah. And it points to a more human feeling just of enthusiasm. And I'm not going to get this quite right, but I think in Greek it means to be infused with the spirit of the gods.
Yeah.
Probably none of us would have started down this path toward Jungian studies if we hadn't been enthused and a bit inflated.
I'm just remembering a little anecdotal story, and I'm sure it's somewhere in maybe Jung's letters. But famously, if somebody came into analysis with Jung and said, oh, I just got a new job. Oh, it's going to be really great. And then Jung would really somberly say, oh, we'll really have to work at that, and somehow we'll just get through it. Just to let some hot air out of the balloon there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You know, I'm kind of wanting to follow the little outline that you provided, Joseph, and
we've just totally violated.
We have gotten enthused or somehow inflated with this topic of inflation. But let's talk about negative inflation.
Yeah.
As the diametric opposite of what we have been focusing on.
Okay, this is such an interesting topic. May I start off with a little mini quote from Jung?
Sure.
Jung talks about a negative inflation as kind of being certain of one's own inferiority, and he associates with the role of the heroic sufferer. So we're into kind of that martyrdom sort of psychology. And he says that both forms are identical. He says conscious megalomania is balanced by unconscious compensatory inferiority. So if outwardly you're presenting, like you're a megalomaniac, on the inside you're feeling very inferior. And conscious inferiority has an unconscious megalomania. So if you're always like, oh, I'm terrible, I'm not very good at that or whatever, that inside there's a real drive for power, which I think is absolutely true, because a lot of times people claim attention, they command that things kind of revolve around them or meet their needs because of their inferiority. It's what is sometimes called tyranny of the weak.
And it seems to me that negative inflation is the introverted form of inflation. Extroverted inflation has to take itself out into the world. And then there is the introverted inflation of this kind of tyranny of the weak and perhaps depression, withdrawal of the I can't and the helplessness, powerlessness, and becoming almost inflated with that. And I think we've probably all seen how that can get kind of compensated for by people in that person's world who know they have to cater to this person,
right,
and have feelings about it of resentment, anger of various kinds. Somebody who's really inflated by powerlessness. And of course, paradoxically, and we all understand that powerlessness can be very powerful.
Yeah, it's not uncommon to have an analysand come in, and often when they're doing a life retrospect, they'll confront things that they wish they had done differently, or legitimate errors that they've made in their lives. And sometimes that will become infused with unconscious forces, so that these mistakes, which seem reasonable given certain circumstances, become enormous, blighting feelings where it darkens the entire landscape of the inner sky. It fills them with dread. It leaves them believing that they are evil and only likely to do evil in the world. It can even lead to a kind of suicidal despair when something is infused with a darkness that is greater than is warranted.
Yeah.
And if we've been raised in homes or religious contexts who enforce or reinforce the idea that God itself is out to kill you because you made this mistake, and that death and torture is right around the corner for you, young lady, that can create a tremendous disproportionate feeling of horror.
And so that negative inflation can go into self-loathing, that the person is, hopeless, worthless, made a horrible mistake. The entire world is blighted because that person forgot an appointment or had a fender bender or some such thing. And that's inflated too.
Yeah.
So something I'd like to shift to for a moment is a little more dialogue around creative inflation. And I feel like I'm understanding this a little more clearly after watching a documentary, which right now is on Netflix, and I really recommend it to people. It's called Struggle, The Life and Lost Art of Zukalski, who is a figure that I knew nothing about. Zukalski was born in the late 1800s, died in 1987, and apparently was a wildly successful Polish sculptor during his life. He was designing and having built massive monuments that were inspired by mythic Polish figures and all kinds of archetypal dynamics. Around 1939, during the siege of Warsaw and the bombing and destruction of Warsaw, none of his monuments survived the war, and he escaped to the United States and lived a very struggling life from the 1940s on. A fellow artist accidentally discovered him, began to meet him, formed a relationship, and through that relationship and in the documentary, we can see the way Zukalski manages his inner life. And one of the declarations that he makes constantly and without reserve is that he is the most brilliant human being that has ever lived, the most talented artist that has ever existed. And he says it with such casual confidence. Now, his art clearly was infused with these archetypal visions that were inspired, that this aspect of the unconscious came to him like a revelation. And his works of art, at least the photographs of them that we can see, are striking and stunning. But also around 1940, because of this inflation, he began to create his own philosophic system called Zermatism, where he claims that he has decoded all aspects of every science and all urges of humanity. And as he continues to foment this extraordinary and disturbing philosophy, he decides that all human beings have come from the Easter Islands, and they are the true sons, and then the sons that were born of Yetis, which is basically Bigfoot, and there's a great war between them in the world. Now, these are archetypal themes which show up in sacred literature, by the way, and show up in popular literature as well. But one of the things that can happen in this creative inflation is that the levels in the psyche begin to blend.
Yep.
Which can make somebody seem like a religious figure, that like a pythoness in the temples of Apollo, overcome by volcanic fumes and then spouting the words of the unconscious directly, which can feel incredibly powerful. Sometimes he could bring forward these revelations, but when his physical reality or the facts of science are then blended with these mythic worlds, people come up with very strange and fantastical ideas, which, by the way, we are seeing with phenomena like QAnon, which is treated as if it's a religious revelation. So I recommend this documentary.
And it was interesting, Joseph. I mean, I haven't gotten all the way through it yet, but one of the things I noted was that as a child, he was fascinated by the sun, and he stared at the sun until he burned his cornea.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, there is an image of inflation and the dangers of that. You know, to think, well, I can look at the sun, and then you suffer the consequences. This is what happened mythologically also to Semele. She was encouraged. She was Zeus's lover, and she was encouraged to demand to see him in his true form. You can't do that as a mortal. She got burned up. So it's this, I think it goes back to what I was saying about Timothy Treadwell. Like you have to know, Joseph, your thing about the levels get conflated or mixed up. You have to keep the archetypal world where it belongs, and then you have to relate to it respectfully. Otherwise, you're going to get burned up like Semele, or, burn your cornea like Zukalski.
So when we mix up the levels, then we lose that faculty of discrimination. And Jung says that is the sine qua non of all consciousness. Consciousness gets invaded and colonized by these ideas, inflation, archetypal contents, possession. It really, really happens. And I'm also looping back to your story of Zukalski, Joseph, of thinking about his inflation in later years with his cosmology, if I can call it that, of how compensatory that must have been to the losses he suffered because of the destruction of his creative work, and having to balance that with these incredibly inflated ideas about his unique savior-style genius.
And then on top of that, because he really was a talented structure, he would in fact bring forward and produce these epic, stunning, massive structures and receive enormous accolades, which almost confirms the value of the blending of the world. And Jung was very interested in Nietzsche in a similar way. Yep. The Western Europe thought Nietzsche was a genius. I think many people would continue to agree with that. And then later in his life, the levels began to blend, and he was writing out of control, bizarre letters to people and signing them Dionysus, and became possessed by some unconscious function that destroyed his safety and his life.
Just to go to the other seat on this seesaw, there is a creative kind of inflation that I think can really serve people. An artist such as Matisse, for example, whose art I happen to be very fond of, and there's a joyfulness in it. He worked with fabric and cutouts and paint and all kinds of things. And he had, by all reports, a very happy, stable family life. So I'm thinking about these creative forces and being inspired by them rather than being taken over by them. We can be a little inflated. We can be a little enthused.
You can have access to these energies without having them take you over.
Yes.
And the difference there is worshiping the gods versus assuming you are a god.
Okay. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. So if we can come into the inner worlds and entreat the archetypes to aid us to feel grateful when we're inspired by these tremendous forces, and to feel humbled and awestruck by the gifts that rise up out of the unconscious, that attitude can keep us very safe and highly productive. Mm-hmm. As a counterpoint, I don't know if you guys have ever seen interviews done by Yo-Yo Ma, the famous cellist. But once in a while, he'll talk about his creative process, and he's thought of as, a musical genius. And there is such an enormous humility. He said, the secret of my playing, which I'm not sure that I've ever told anyone in an interview, is love. That I am in an extraordinary state of love when I perform. So
that's lovely.
I think there are examples of this being held beautifully, being held tragically, being held magically. It may be something that's even required to bring forward great works of art, that there is a cost to our humanity to be a vehicle for this. I may be speaking out of turn, but I think that Jung also suffered this and felt that it came at great cost. That he felt a creative daimon, a creative spirit just owned him and was constantly, shoving its creative demands into his head to the point where he felt he could just never rest.
He also said that his life, at one point in his life, that his life no longer belonged to him alone. And so he was in service to something greater. And I'm also looping back to your lovely reference to Yo-Yo Ma, and that the secret in his playing is love. And that takes us into Jung's famous comment that where love is, power is not. And perhaps the antidote to inflation is being in service to something greater, and the love for that value, the love in Yo-Yo Ma's case for making such beautiful music that he's shared with the world.
Maybe this is a good place to transition into a dream.
Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work, but producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
Our dreamer today is a 31-year-old male, and he works as a night lead janitor. And here is this fellow's dream. Midway up a mountain, I tried to get rid of my firstborn son, who was the size of a baby Yoda. My last attempt was to throw him into water in hopes it breaks and he freezes to death. He gets close a few times, but always comes back to me. At this time, I hear a woman in the distance yelling, telling me to stop, and saying she would help, and asking for my number. I ignore her, and decide I better just grab my son and head up the mountain. I put him under my shirt. As he hugs my chest, he is freezing but warms up quickly. The last half of the mountain has a huge canvas sheet over it. It's colored yellow, black, and orange. I grip it with my hand and climb up. It's hard. At no point does it ever ease up. My muscles are burning, I'm losing strength. When I'm near the edge, to get to the top, I have to give it everything to just get up to the top. I almost fall, but I did make it. Once up, I find a hidden compartment that has food and water. I rest before we descend. The lady made it up, and she has a guy with her. She asked if I used the canvas to make it up. I said yes. She replied it's beginning to tear, so she didn't use it. I showed her the compartment. She began talking about descending and not using the zip line to make it down this time. I tell her I need to practice ascending and descending vertically more. As a context, he writes that he's struggling with deciding to go to therapy or not. He says he has a suicidal history and has some self-harm issues. The feelings in the dream are despair, numbness, conviction, suffering, tiredness, exhaustion, joy, and grayness. And he adds, I used to be an avid hiker. I'm struggling with taking care of myself.
Well, I find this dream really moving.
Say more.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, but maybe I'll just sort of take a first pass. Why is he trying to get rid of his son, essentially kill his son? You know, what I'd be curious, how come you're trying to get rid of your son? But I see it psychologically as some part of the psyche is addressing a lot of aggression toward some small, tender part of himself. And so there's an image there of kind of self-harm, and that may relate to the self-harm and suicidality, that he wants to kill some tender young part of himself and kill it by freezing it, actually. So freezing feeling. But it doesn't work. And then he's holding his son close to his chest, and his son is warming up. So feeling is coming back. And then he has a tremendous difficulty to climb to the top. But there's a woman, so there's an anima figure who's saying, no, stop. And that maybe also relates to the return of feeling. And I'm very moved also by the image of this compartment that he finds that's filled with food and water.
Yes.
And there is a secret resource that this man didn't know that he had.
I'm paying attention to how I'm finding this dream incredibly moving, and what a huge mix of feeling there is in it. And that's exactly what the dreamer says. He's got this whole big range of feeling of how hard ascending this mountain is. And both the woman in the distance who says stop and that she will help him, and then the this canvas sheet and the compartment that has sustenance hidden in it. So I think I'm kind of imagining the feeling tone of what this dreamer is going through in his life that he reports on, and the hopefulness that he does reclaim his newborn son, who warms up. It appears that he does listen to the woman in the distance telling him to stop and saying that she would help. And I would be curious with this dreamer about where and who are the sources of help in his life and in his own soul that he may not be acknowledging enough.
Yeah, there are real inner resources here. And he says that he's struggling to take care of himself.
Yeah.
But what we see in the dream is he's taking care of himself. He does, warm up the little child, and he does find sustenance.
Yeah.
It's a struggle. It's a struggle, but he does it.
If I stand very far away from the dream and do not approach it in a naturalistic way, then the son, for me, represents all of his responsibilities. But there's something about him being responsible for this child or his children, the things in his life that cry out with their needs. And he left feeling either resentful and or unable to answer these cries, these needs, and how better for him to want these needs to die. And in that way, to freeze, to destroy, to annihilate some level of his own primordial needs and desires. And if he could just do that, then he could just trudge forward in this donkey-like existence, in a state of kind of numb acceptance of circumstance. And quite importantly, his soul, in the form of this woman, gently and persistently says that she'll help him. You have help. Just ask for the help. The real failure in the dream is that he cannot find it in himself to align with her. He turns her away.
So there, in a way, I go to what in repeated image this is, a struggle on the part of ego, the dream ego. And I'm relating that to his history of suicidal ideation and self-harm and depression, and struggling with deciding to go to therapy or not. So there is a potential source of help parallel in the external world to how he interacts with the woman in the dream. That help is available, but he doesn't avail himself of it.
Yeah, even though he ignores her, it does seem to bring about some shift in the dream. I think it's at that point that he grabs his son and starts climbing up the mountain. So something about her appearance seems to bring some kind of shift, and then she does meet him at the top. I think it's interesting that he says that the dream ends with him saying, I need to practice ascending and descending. And I wonder a little bit if that's sort of a call for psychic fitness to be able to deal better with both descending into our depths and also ascending out of them into more of an adaptive frame.
I'd like to amplify the dream a little bit with the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham was the great patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. God tells Abraham that he will produce children and that his children and his progeny will be as fecund as the stars in the heaven. Isaac, his son, is born, and at some point in Isaac's youth, Abraham was commanded by God to offer his son up as a sacrifice in the land of Moriah. Abraham traveled 3 days until he came to the mount that God told him of. He then commanded the servants to remain while he and Isaac went alone into the mountain. Isaac carried the wood upon which he would be sacrificed. Along the way, Isaac asked his father where the animal for the burnt offering was, to which Abraham replied, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering. Just as Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, he was interrupted by the angel of the Lord, and he saw behind him a ram caught in a thicket by its horns, which he sacrificed instead of his son. The place was later named Jehovah-Jireh. For his obedience, he received another promise of numerous descendants and abundant prosperity. So there is a bit of parallel. We don't have a preamble to the dream. There is no explanation as to what commanded him to sacrifice his son. I would suspect there is some archetypal underpinning around this, and that the female figure in the dream, much like the angel of the Lord, intervenes and tries to stop him from sacrificing his son.
I appreciate, and I imagine our dreamer appreciates that amplification, Joseph. That's really beautiful. And it also illustrates exactly how amplification can work. You are not alone. This has happened before. Something greater than you are understands this pattern, understands this experience. I'm switching over to something more mundane, which keeps coming up for me. Of the last half of the mountain has a huge canvas sheet over it, colored yellow, black, and orange. So I'm puzzled and interested in this image of a mountain with a huge canvas sheet over it. It aids our dream ego in his ascent. And yet there is an interesting and surprising image here. It's very specific.
Yeah, it is really curious, and it does carry with it the sense of something being covered up.
And a canvas is also something upon which we paint. Mm-hmm. It's a surface that invites creativity, and it has these colors on it. It's a man-made thing that is covering something that nature has created, namely the mountain.
And I wonder if it's an image in some sense of defense, because it does cover something up, and mm-hmm. it enables him to climb up, but by the time she climbs up, it's already ripping.
Yeah.
So somehow it's like the defense is giving way. It's not working anymore, which isn't always a bad thing.
Joseph has that I'm thinking expression on.
Well, I'm curious about that. The female figure asks if he used the canvas to make it up, meaning to make it up to the top of the mountain. Mm-hmm. So the canvas acts as a kind of a tether, a rope, something that he can grab onto to pull himself up to the next level, perhaps to pull himself up out of his depression, to pull himself up into some relationship, to a a spiritual attitude, something greater, pull himself up to a perspective. Sometimes Jung talked about the sublimatio. In alchemy, sublimatio is when a solid substance, when it's heated, bypasses a liquid state and goes right into a vaporous state. So sometimes we can be criticized for just kind of floating up into a spiritual bypass. But many other times when we are mired in something that we simply cannot get a perspective on, that the center of the personality, the spiritual center of the personality, will take us and push us upward to the top of the mountain, so to speak, with the hope that we can then look down and see our suffering in a much larger context, in a larger context of life and drive and possibility. We might come away from that experience understanding that our suffering is only a small part of the world or a small part of our psychic potential. That can give us a tremendous amount of hope and capacity to bear what we are suffering. So something in the psyche might have laid the canvas or laid this fabric over the mountain to help the ego in its attempt to claw itself up to a broader perspective. The lesson he takes at the end of the dream is that he needs to practice ascending and descending vertically more. What I would venture as an interpretation is the dream has delivered its message, and that he needs to be able to rise up to states of tremendous objectivity and perhaps even a very analytic attitude, and then descend downward into these really difficult and struggling places, and that he needs an easy traversing of those levels and attitudes in order to get safely through what this crisis is for him.
Yeah,
That's lovely.
I think it's also a hopeful indicator that he shows the woman the compartment that he found that has food and water. So there is some connection here with the woman and anima figure, a very powerful inner figure, often represented by a person of the opposite sex from the dreamer. And so he is willing to reach out to her and share this resource. And I agree with what you said about the ascents and descents and objectivity versus subjective experience. The trajectory of the dream points to a path forward.
It does. And I think, Joseph, that's a brilliant way of putting it. You know, if we can be in our feelings and in our suffering and have the capacity to get above that and see it and be and think about it. So feel with and think about. Then suffering can really become transformational. And I feel I have this sense of hope for this dreamer. Some really extraordinary work.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.